Chapter 1. The City of Death. Morning descends upon the small town of Crescentville, and the sun is approaching halfway to the top of the sky. Ponies begin to go about their daily lives, like they always have, dealing with their hardships of the current lives, and hoping for the future. Shops open, and patrons surge through the dirt streets of the town. In the town's center begins the very same event that occurs each and every day, as it has for months. A white-cloaked unicorn enters the center and begins to ring a bell he carried with him. His face was hidden behind a bird's mask, the mask encompassing his entire face, save for a hole for his horn. As he rang the bell, he used his magic to send its chime resounding throughout the town. He enhanced his voice with his magic as well, and spoke to the town as a whole. Citizens of Crescentville, I welcome you good morning, and hope you have lasted throughout the night as best you could. I doubt all of us were that lucky, however. The plague is still thriving, a cure unfound. But you can all do your part for prevention. Bring out your dead. While you may have cared for them when they were alive, keeping them with you will only cause you harm. Bring them out and help load them onto the carts as they make their rounds. Not only is the plague spread by the living, but it is spread by the decomposing dead. Bring out your dead. Only then can you minimize your exposure to the plague. Countless have already died, so know that you are not alone in your mourning. Bring out your dead, and only then can their mourning begin, as the holy flames destroy the plague from their very souls. As a reminder to all citizens, withholding the dead and hiding them is punishable by hanging. The dead are not only a threat to you and your families, but a threat to the town as a whole. Count Crescent feels your pain, and mourns the loss of each subject as his own. The Count's own daughter, Waning, was taken by the plague just months ago. Trust me when I say that he knows your pain. So please, do the responsible and noble thing. Bring out your dead. The typical speech. It encourages everyone to take their dead family members and neighbors who died overnight from the plague and load them into carts. Though the part about the Count's daughter was added only shortly after her death. The carts get loaded each and every day, at approximately this time each and every day. And so my family's clinic gets these carts and their dead passengers each and every day. Of course, it wasn't always like this. 2 months ago, the carts went to the undertaker's house. However, after Rust, the undertaker, after his death from the plague, all of his work became our work. It was just a simple matter of moving backwards of the chain of events. Our clinic would inspect the dead and determine if they died from the plague and needed burning, or if they died from something else and could be buried. Rust would take care of burning the corpses or burying the dead. But that was before he died. Now, my father and I have taken up Rust's job as well. My father, Sawblade, had been teaching me about medicine. He had wanted me to take over the clinic when he died, as was tradition like his father, grandfather, and so on had done. My mother, Serenity, and younger sister, Lyric, tended to the housework, cooking, and shopping. So far, our family was one of the few that had been lucky enough to not feel the effects of the plague. Speaking of the plague, I suppose I should explain exactly what it is, at least to our knowledge. Supposedly, the first case happened around a year ago when a rat bit some pony. The plague has only been in our town and kingdom for a few months, but it is very deadly and an infectious disease. At first, you will develop a slight cough. The next morning, you will find yourself paralyzed. After a few more hours, blood will begin to trickle down from your eyes, nose, and mouth. Within another hour, sometimes up to 2, your throat will close up, and you'll begin to suffocate. but that is the least of your worries. Before you can suffocate, your internal organs will begin to fail and rupture. The pain is excruciating, and you will scream throughout your final night. In total, the time it takes to die from the disease is 2 nights from contraction. The plague is what we ponies call it. Personally, I think it's kind of a dumb name. That is like calling a type of a tree the tree. But they do it because, thus far in history, it is the single most devastating sickness to befall pony kind. Though, I should also mention that it isn't just pony kind. The disease also infects griffins, zebra, buffalo. Really, it infects many of the intelligent creatures. The disease spreads through the air and bodily fluids, even cross-species. The only way to stop the spread is to burn the corpses, isolate the victims, or wear a plague mask, like the mourners wear. The stallion from this morning, the one yelling, "Bring out your dead," is a mourner. The Mourners is an organization established by our kingdom, the Moon Kingdom, to fight the plague. However, due to the limited nature of the herbs required in the manufacture of plague masks, the herbs which filter out the plague, only the mourners have plague masks. King Lamoon has ordered the mourners to every town, so each town has at least one. Some larger towns have more, however. I should note that Count Crescent is the 13th son of King Lamoon, and was granted land in recognition of his royal birth. However, the mourners are a joke. In reality, they are just nobles who oversee how the plague is dealt with. They pass down noble decrees and direct us around. But in reality, my father and I are the ones who combat the disease. In our town, at least. The mourner just sits in the Count's castle, safe behind his mask, and never lends us a hoof in dealing with the dead or the plague. He just gets up, gives his speech, and returns to the castle, safe and sound, no more than a coward. I woke up this morning to the mourner's cries. It seems that I have slept in longer than usual today. No real loss, however. My work didn't start until the corpses arrived anyway, and that was still a few hours away from when the mourner gave his speech. I rolled out of my bed of hay and onto my hooves, trotting over to my mirror to inspect myself. As I approached the mirror, I came into view. My black coat was slightly ruffled, and my white mane and tail were a tangled mess. I levitated up my brush and began grooming myself. After I had finished brushing, I turned and looked about my room. It wasn't anything special. The floors were wooden, and the walls were made from stone. The ceiling, like many buildings in our town, had wooden supports below a hay roof. The room was small, and only contained my bed, a mirror, and a small table, which I set my brush on. It wasn't lavish by any means. We weren't rich like the Count and other nobles, but we made do with what we had. I was at least happy that I had a window with a view that wasn't either our other house or the dying town. I could look out over the countryside, which was always a welcome sight to the things I saw over the course of each day. Trees dotted the landscape, and hills rolled as far as I could see. It was a peaceful scene. I left my room and went to our kitchen, where my mother, Serenity, was cooking. She had a white coat and a red mane and tail. Her cutie mark was a wooden spoon, which made sense, since she was a brilliant cook. However, it struck me as odd that she should be cooking at this time of day, and I asked her as much. "Oh, good morning, Grell. I thought you might be waking up soon, and would be hungry, so I figured I would make you something. It's only carrot stew, but we can also eat it for lunch," Serenity told me. I trotted over to our table and sat down as I asked her. I didn't know how, but she always managed to do this. I could wake up any time of the day, and she would know when I was going to, and have food ready for me. She always called it mother's intuition, but I was curious if that was really all there was to it. After a few minutes of thinking to myself, my sister, Lyric, came into the room. Lyric began walking around and setting up the table. She had a red coat, and her mane and tail were brown. Lyric helped my mother with much of the housework, despite being younger than me. However, my mother would often shoo her away so that Lyric could play. It was probably due to this that Lyric had gotten her cutie mark at a remarkably young age. Her cutie mark was a musical note. My mother thought that fillies of her age shouldn't be stifled in the house, helping their mothers all day, and encouraged her to go outside and play with friends. Though Lyric preferred to find someplace quiet and sing, and had become quite good at singing. There wasn't a doubt in my mind that she would become a notable singer in the future. "Where's Father?" I asked to both of them. I hadn't seen him yet, but I figured, like always, he would be in the clinic which adjoined our house. I think Dad's in the clinic. He should be setting things up for today," Lyric told me. I had figured as much. He really needed a hobby. He spent too much time in there. With that realization, Mother finally finished cooking and gave me a helping of carrot stew. I thanked her and ate it quickly. Time was slowly running out, and I had work to do. It was delicious. I finished eating and thanked my mother once again. Then I got up and exited the kitchen through the door leading to our clinic. Father wasn't there, but I did guess it was about that time. He was busy elsewhere at this time. The clinic was where all of our medical treatment to our live patients happened. It had several counters, which had medical supplies and items laid upon them. Above those counters were cabinets filled with medicines, bandages, and other healing items. In the center of the room was a table the patients would sit or lie on, whichever was required. Along a wall was a bench where waiting patients would sit while we helped the current. Like my room, it wasn't luxurious. However, it was one of the better in the buildings that were in our town, save for the Count's castle. I took a final look around the room before I left the clinic and entered our adjoining surgery room. With the mourners being useless, this meant my father and I were this town's only hope. Our town's population was 21,329 before the plague. As of today, deducting last night's death, our population stands at 5,261. Even though I'm still young in my years, this sort of work has long since become mundane to me. It no longer causes me shock and disgust. Even before taking up Rust's job, my knowledge of medical aid and procedures, and witnessing them done, my senses began to deaden. However, despite my medical knowledge or prowess, which began to evolve further than even my father's, I still did not have my cutie mark. It wasn't until we took up Rust's undertaking job that I got it. A week into digging graves, burying corpses, and dealing in the dead, I got my cutie mark. It was somewhat ominous one, but I felt it fitting. My cutie mark was a staff with two serpents winding up of it, and atop the staff was the skull of a pony. The staff and the serpents made sense. It had long been associated with medicine. However, the skull was out of place. Soon, I decided that it was symbolic for my workings involving death. And so I reasoned that it was my destiny to heal the dead, or, more reasonably, cure the plague. That was my belief, anyhow. And I lived my life with hopes of doing just that. I studied the plague, learned all I could about it, but things aren't as easy as they seem. Today's Hall of Corpses gave me more test subjects, but before I could run tests on them, we have to do the routine inspections. Don't want to burn non-infested corpses, after all. We got 14 corpses in total. Today was a good day. I once had a day with 127 deaths. It was a long day. Sawblade unloaded the corpses and put them into our holding room. I brought out the first two and laid them upon the 2 tables we used for dissections. As he unloaded the rest, I laid out our tools and prepared the bodies. Once prepared, I awaited Sawblade to begin the dissections. As I did so, I looked at the 2 ponies in front of me, laid upon our tables. The first one, which Sawblade would be dissecting, was a familiar-looking stallion. He had been the baking assistant, if I'm not mistaken. I never knew his name. He showed no clear signs of being infected with the plague. Many didn't, though. Many ponies wanted their loved ones to look good, even if they were infected, so they would clean up the blood, which would help to give away the plague. It was foolish, however. If they were going to be burned anyway, I didn't see the point. Not only that, but since the plague is transferred via bodily fluids, they put themselves at risk of getting infected. But without going into homes on a regular basis and stopping ponies from doing that, there was little we could do to enforce it. Every pony knew, flyers were everywhere around the town, about preventing the plague. The stallion had a brown coat, with a mane and tail which were gray. His cutie mark was a rolling pin. I opened his eyes and looked at them, and they were blue, and had once been full of life. Now they were dull and lifeless. I couldn't see any blood lingering about them. Either he didn't have the plague, his eyes didn't bleed, or whoever cleaned him was very thorough. I closed his eyes once more, and opened his mouth. Well, he had decent teeth, at least. I'll give him that. Oh, what's this? Some blood is lingering around his gums. That could be a sign of the plague. But a few other diseases did that too, so we can't just assume. A full dissection is necessary. I left the stallion alone, and turned my attention to the other pony, the one I would be dissecting. This pony was a mare. She had a gray coat, and a mane and tail which were black. She was somewhat pretty, but not really my type. Not to mention, she's dead. Anyhow, if I recall correctly, she was the daughter of some family. They did some sort of farming, but that's all I knew. I turned my attention to her eyes. As I did with the other stallions, I opened them. They were amber in color, and just as lifeless as the others. If there's one thing you can trust the dead to be, it is predictable. In all the examinations I've done, I actually have discovered 2 ponies who were alive and simply paralyzed, and were thrown out onto the carts by their families. All thanks to looking at their eyes. I actually amused me, discovering that a family had thrown away a perfectly good pony. Life is precious in these times, after all. And upon reuniting with their families, the anger they released at being thrown into a cart full of corpses and thought of as dead is too humorous to ignore. Within a month, however, both of those I found alive returned to my table thanks to the plague. But back to the mare who is currently resting on my table. Her eyes were devoid of blood residue, so I opened her mouth. Her teeth were not as good as the stallion's, but she had no blood in her mouth either. Maybe she didn't fall to the plague, but we can't know for sure yet. I closed her mouth and took a look in her ears, still finding no blood. Well, there's one place infected mares will bleed from, that stallions will not. I lay her head down upon the table and made my way around to her flank. Not bad, I think to myself. But again, she's dead. I drew my gaze to her genitals. No blood residue outside. But given family cleanings and all, I drew myself closer and opened her up, looking inside. Well, she's definitely pink, but nothing out of place in here. Well, well, Grell! Getting friendly with the young lady there! A voice calls out to me. Oh, Sawblade. Finished up today's bodies, huh? I asked my father. He was always an upbeat fellow. He didn't let the plague get him down. He had a brown coat and a black mane and tail. Oh, you're no fun, son. I expected a reaction out of you. Sawblade looked disappointed. I remember when I was training under my father, I used to stare at the flanks of the cute dead mares too, when I was your age. He would always abruptly enter the room just to get a reaction out of me. Embarrassed me to death most of the time. I'm not doing anything to be embarrassed about. I'm simply looking for the signs of the plague. I'm not as perverted as you, I retorted. Anyway, are you ready to begin? I looked yours over, and he had bloody gums, but no other signs. Mine seems to be clean, but you can never be too sure. Sawblade sighed. Sometimes, I worry that these times are taking a toll on you, but you're a valuable assistant. Let's begin. At Sawblade's decree, we began dissecting our bodies. I always think of these side-by-side dissections as a race between Sawblade and I. In the past, I was quite slow, but I've gained speed. So much so that we finish almost at the same time, though I begin to finish first. Regardless of who finishes first, the procedure is basically the same each time. I lay the mare on her right side and walk around to her belly. Using my magic, I pick up a scalpel and hover it at the end or center of her breast. Focusing my magic, I pierce the blade into her flesh. Slight blood begins to trickle out from the blade. If she were alive, there would be a lot more blood. I continue to pull the scalpel horizontally down her belly, about a pony's head long. With the main incision complete, I pull out the scalpel and place it once again at her breast, this time slightly above the first cut. I pierce her flesh once more, and drag the blade vertically down until it hits the first cut, and continue down further, creating the letter T on her underside. I pull out the blade and place it down where the first incision ended, only higher. For the third and final time, I pierce her flesh, and drag the blade vertically once more, mimicking the second cut. I pull out the blade for the last time, and her underside now bears the letter I. I know it is odd, but I call this series of cuts the lateral tissue incision, mainly due to the fact that it makes the initials LTI. It involves cutting of the tissue and an incision. And as you make the first cut, you make a lowercase l, a capital T, and an uppercase I. It isn't exactly what the professional name is. I don't really care for official names, because you end up with things being called the plague. I prefer naming things myself, so that way I can quickly explain and know what I'm talking about. Regardless, this is just the first step, anyhow. I float aside the scalpel and levitate up some pins. While the pins float, I grab a hold of the mare's newly created flaps of flesh and pull them outward. They make a squelching sound as they pull away from the remaining skin, muscle, and bone. Once I pull them open, I float the pins over to hover at the corners of the flesh, and using my magic, I pierce her skin once more and pin the flaps to the table. Now her bones and organs are naked and exposed to my eyes. I peer inside as I float the saw up to her and begin sawing at her ribcage. Before I learned to maintain my tools, this used to take a while. My saw would be dulled and barely make any headway through the ribs and sternum. I soon learned that if you sharpen your tools and maintain them properly, the time is significantly cut down. Speaking of which, I'm already done sawing. Nothing beats well-maintained tools. I float aside the saw and grab a hold of her ribcage with my magic. While it is only half, it is still a large amount of bone. I carefully ease it out, and as always, it shows little resistance. I set the ribs on the table and take in the view of her no longer obscured organs. Say what you will about outer appearances, how some are beautiful or handsome while others are not, but everyone looks the same on the inside. Well, not quite. Males and females have different organs. That much is apparent. However, I also learned that those who frequently drink alcohol will have their livers discolored, but all the same regardless. And this mare wasn't an exception. Heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, intestines. Everything was there. I inspected each one carefully, but I didn't see any sign of organ failure or rupturing, which would be the telltale sign of the plague. I smiled. Looks like this one will get to be buried. Well, looks like this mare was lucky. She didn't die of the plague. She will get to be buried, and can have a grave her family can visit to remember her. I said, directing my voice towards Sawblade. How is your dissection turning out? It appears mine is not so lucky. His insides are infested with the plague. Another corpse for the pyres. Is that so? Unfortunately, that is the news many families will receive these days. All we can do is give them an invitation to watch the pyre. They don't get a special place to mourn their loss. Irritation began to show in my voice. You're starting to sound like an old stallion, looking bad at how horrible things are. But we can't allow the plague to spread. Burning those infected so that they can't infect their loved ones is all we can do for those who remain alive. I wish you could have been born after all this mess ended, son. My father started. His voice was filled with worry and sadness. It always made me angry when he said things like that. If I hadn't been born when I was, who knows what would have happened? Perhaps my father would have caught the plague and died before he could have had me. Then I wouldn't have been born in the first place. Don't say that, Dad. If it wasn't for the times we currently live in, my medical skills wouldn't have developed as quickly as they did. You couldn't have known the plague would have shown up. In a way, it's both a blessing and a curse. No need to worry about it. I hope my words had put him at ease, and we could get through the day without many more conversations like this. I suppose you're right. But I still don't think a colt your age should have to witness things like this. A hint of worry still showed in his voice. The conversation died off, and we returned to our work. The dissection was complete, and she showed no signs of being infected. All we really did was look inside to check the conditions of the organs, anyhow. I levitated up and removed the ribcage section, and replaced it back into her body. Using some wire, I tied the loose ribcage to the remaining ribs. It just had to look good till she was buried, and this would do the trick. I pulled out the pins holding the flaps of flesh back, and moved the flaps back against her body as I floated the pins aside. I then floated up a needle and some strong thread, and proceeded to thread the needle. I placed a hoof on the mare's cut flesh, holding it in place. Floating the needle over the top of the left cut, I stabbed the needle into her flesh, and began to sew her cuts up. Stitch, 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 stitch. I finished the left side in about a minute, cut and tied off the thread. I moved to the right side and began to stitch that cut up. Stitch, 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 stitch. Another lovely stitch. I cut and tied off the right side and began stitching the middle. Stitch, 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 stitch. I finished tying up the final cut and set the needle and thread back down on the table. Finished. How about you, Dad? Did I beat you this time? I asked him with a smirk. I know that I did. I just wanted to gloat slightly. Already? You certainly are getting faster. I'm only beginning stitching my second cut. Well, good work. Well, practice makes perfect. Anyhow, I'll place her in the storage room and grab another one. I levitated the mare back onto my back, and trotted into the storage room. It was slightly below ground, and was cooler than the rest of our house and clinic. This way, the corpses would stay relatively fresh, and not rot too fast. Mother would complain about the smell if the rotting process progressed too far, and the scent wafted into the house. Since we didn't have that many bodies today, we could lay them out without stacking them, and even had room to spare. I walked to the back corner of the room, which is empty, and away from the uncut bodies. I floated the mare off my back and laid her down. It was unfortunate, but her burial had to wait. The longer we had unknown cause of death corpses, the higher risk we ran of the plague spreading. I wasted no time after setting her down, and levitated up another corpse, laying it across my back, and trotted back into the surgery room. After the routine inspection and cutting open this stallion, a cream-coated gent with a burgundy mane and tail, I began to inspect his organs. His eyes, ears, and mouth were all bloody, so I expected he was infected with the plague. His organs confirmed my suspicions. Mostly all of them were blackened and leaking blood, bile, acids, and other such fluids. Well, normally inside of the organs, not outside, and in the body cavity. In addition to the normal fluids, there was plenty of pus. I never understood the plague, where most other diseases targeted one thing in a pony and destroyed it, such as alcohol does with the liver. The plague goes after every organ, sparing none. It is almost as if the plague wants to get rid of everything that was pony inside the host. It was a dreadful, disgusting, and painful way to die. Even if having it wasn't enough, the mental realization that you could spread the disease to your loved ones, and then infect them with it as well, well, let's just say we've had numerous ponies kill themselves at the first signs of the plague. However, the first sign is coughing. Plenty of other, very treatable diseases involve coughing. This unfortunately meant that many of those who killed themselves, attempting to prevent spreading the plague to their loved ones, were not actually infected with it, and thus killed themselves in vain. I find the practice both noble and foolish. Nevertheless, I quickly sewed up the stallion and took him back into the storage room. At this point, my father had already finished his first and grabbed a second. I made sure he placed him in a separate area from the previous mare. I didn't want any mix-ups about which bodies were clean and which were not. Luckily he did, and I followed suit, dropping this stallion next to his. I grabbed another and set to work. This was very repetitious work, and it slightly bored me. Despite being quite squeamish in my first dissection, I am quite calm about it now. With the hundreds of bodies I have dissected, the things I have seen, I did not have time to be squeamish. Once the plague reared its head, my dissection count rapidly began to rise. Prior to it, I probably had only done 1 or 2 at most. After about 10 or so, you gain your composure. After 50, you are so professional at it, you could basically do it in your sleep. After 100, you start seeing them less as ponies, and more as hunks of meat. And then, after a few more, you finally stop caring completely, and just do your job. Especially if those stages came within the first few days. Despite the boredom, it was my job, and I pushed through it as quickly as I could. Even with stopping to eat lunch, the carrot stew Mother made, we had finished at a decent time. In total, I conducted 8, while my father did 6. I was faster, and my mindset helped. He was too playful and silly, and tended to goof off. At the end of the day, we had 12 plague-related deaths, and 2 unrelated deaths. Each of us got to dissect some pony who wasn't infected. And that can't be said every day, so today was good. It was barely into the afternoon, and most of our work had been completed. Unless anyone came to the clinic or for something, all we had left to do was burn the infected and bury the clean. Attempting to save as much time as possible, I told my father, who decided to take a break after the dissections, that I would go prepare the pyre and graves. He nodded, but looked at me worriedly. I swiftly left the room before he could say anything. I went to my room and threw on my saddlebags, then trotted outside towards the undertaker's shack. After taking over that job, we decided to leave all the tools for that trade in his shack, instead of bringing them back and forth with us each time we needed them, which had been each and every day for months, so it was a good idea. Crescentville had a very simple layout to it. In the center, there was the town square. Well, it was a circle, really. For a short distance north of it, trees, long dead now, stood on each side of the street. At the end of this street rose the Count's castle, surrounded by walls and protected by guards. In every other direction, and spreading behind the castle as well, were streets and buildings. It was laid out in cobweb-like fashion, a circle of buildings with a road in front and behind them, then another circle of buildings around that circle, and another circle, and another. In total, there were about 15 circles of buildings, both shops and houses. Of course, there were some small roads connecting each ring. However, the planner had clearly not planned far ahead, as these roads were not straight, but instead caused you to zigzag to get from one side of town to the other. It was a mess. My house was on the 13th ring, and luckily, the Undertaker's shack was on this side of town, not the other. It was set off a good distance from the rest of the town, and I could make it there in 10 minutes, at a decent trot. If it weren't for the roads, I could probably make it in 5, or less. I arrived at the shack, a small, all-wooden structure with a stone floor. It was about 2 ponies square and 3 high. Nothing fancy. It contained a bed, a bookcase, and a table with tools on it. These tools were all we needed to do the Undertaker's job. An axe to gather and split wood, a shovel to dig graves, a hammer, and some nails to make the grave markers from split wood. I floated the axe and some nails into my saddlebags, and slipped the shovel through the top of the one, since it was too long to actually fit inside. With everything I needed gathered, I set off towards the graveyard nearby. Despite the thousands of dead citizens, our graveyard had barely expanded. The piles of ash around the pyres, however, continued to grow. The pyre victims didn't get markers. There was no way to remember them once they were gone, besides the ash, which mixed with the others. I decided to first start digging the graves, since I only needed 2. While the digging wasn't all that really taxing on me, since I was a unicorn, I really wondered how Rust, an earth pony, had managed to do his job so well. Either he hit his exhaustion really well, or he was stronger and tougher than he looked. For him, digging a grave would take around an hour each. For me, it took roughly 15 minutes, thanks to my magic. It would take me only 30 minutes to dig these 2 graves. By my calculations, however, I finished a bit faster than that. I stabbed the shovel in the ground, since we would need it here later on anyway. I turned my attention to getting wood for the grave markers and the pyre, so I galloped to the forest, which was a short ways away. The forest had seen better days. It was never that big to begin with, and Rust failed to replant any of the trees after he cut them down. I started doing that, but since they take years to grow, the forest was slowly shrinking. Depending on the size of the tree, one would last us only a week or more. Today I was fresh out of wood, so I had to cut another down. I found a decently sized one, and began to hack at it. Again, I wondered how Rust had managed to do this. It took me only minutes to cut through and fall the tree. I cut the branches off the tree and chopped them into manageable pieces. I levitated those over near the stump. I floated one onto the stump and chopped it in half, then chopped another one in half so it was shorter than the other, and finally cut each half so that they were flat on each side. I took both of these pieces and made a cross, using the hammer and some nails to connect them. Lastly, I cut the bottom of the cross so that it was a point. I repeated this process to make a second cross. With the crosses complete, I swung the axe into the stump, and took the crosses back to the graves I had dug previously. I thrust the crosses' points into the ground just above the graves, and used the hammer to pound each securely into the ground. The graves were now mostly complete. We just needed to bury the bodies. The families would be notified and could write on the graves later, if they wanted to. I floated the hammer back to my bags and trotted back into the forest. I magically pulled out the axe from the stump and began to chop up the other branches of the downed tree, using the stump to split them into more manageable pieces. I slipped the wood into my saddlebags till they were full, at which point I buried the axe back into the stump and levitated some more wood around me. I could only carry a small amount, but the more I could carry now, the fewer trips I would have to make. I began trotting towards the pyre to start stacking wood. While I approached the pyre, my gaze wandered back towards town. I noticed my father pulling a cart behind him. He must have finished his break and decided to bring the corpses here. It was about time. Any longer, and I could have taken care of everything myself. I turned my attention back to the pyre. Our pyre consisted of a slightly raised circle of earth, about 3 ponies in width, on which some wood and bodies would be placed. Around this circle, there was a slight gorge, in which more wood would be placed to surround it entirely in flames. I floated some spare wood that I was levitating into the circular platform, and arranged it as flatly as I could across the top. I did the same with the wood in my saddlebags until the platform was covered. After doing that, I only had a few logs left, and I magically tossed those into the gorge. It was at this point my father got within talking distance. "You're always hard at work as always, Grell. Dug the graves, made the markers, and even started the pyre. Good work, son. Did I really take that long?" "No, father. I just worked fast. I've had a decent amount of practice at it, you know." "Crap. Did I just say that?" And now he's going to give me one of his worried looks and speeches. But, thinking quickly, I added, "Go ahead and lay the clean ponies in the graves. I'm going to get more wood for the pyre," I told him, as I began trotting towards the forest. Okay. I will see you in a while then, Grell," he replied. Speech dodged. When I was halfway to the forest, I looked back at him. He was doing as I said, and was levitating the 2 clean ponies into the graves to bury. But he still had an unsettled look on his face. He worried about me too much, but I still loved him. He was both my father and teacher, after all. I reached the newly fallen tree and began to collect more wood. When I had returned, Father had finished burying the 2 clean ponies, and had piled the diseased corpses on the pyre. I took the logs I had with me and placed them in the gorge surrounding the platform. I had just enough to complete the pyre. My father stood watching as I backed away from the pyre and walked to his side. "Is it ready, Grell?" my father asked, his voice somewhat full of sorrow. "Yeah, it's ready whenever you are," I told him. He nodded to me, and slowly trotted up to the pyre. Sawblade stood at the edge of the gorge, and looked over the pyre. He breathed a sigh, and lowered his horn toward the wood in the gorge. His horn lit up with a flash, and then sparks came out, showering over the logs. They slowly caught fire, and began to burn brilliantly, as he walked back to my side, and turned to stare at the pyre with me. He always got depressed while watching the pyres. I told him many times he could go back to the house, and I would make sure it burned out safely, but he would always decline my offer. As I drifted into the thought, Father bowed his head and began to pray. "O gods in the stars above, I ask you to look over these souls as they make their way up to you. I beg your forgiveness in defiling their corpses so. As much as it pains me, a proper burial was impossible. Watch over the families and loved ones of these poor souls who had to depart before their time. I pray to the 2 gods which overlook us each and every night and day. This plague on our land continues to take a terrible toll. I pray thee, and your thousands of brothers and sisters, bring about a swift end to this plague. Guide the souls of those who died from it, and see that they are happy in the afterlife." He always said a similar prayer each time we lit the pyre, and watched the corpses burn. I suppose it was as much for his benefit as it was for theirs. I bowed my head and gave a quiet respect to those who died. The Church of the Stars and the thousands of gods they worshipped. If they truly existed, would they not have stepped in by now? I cannot say that I still follow my father's religion, but I can at least understand the need to pay respect to the dead. We continue watching the pyre until the ashes of the logs combined with those of the pony corpses, and the corpses became ash, and the fires burned themselves out. We gave one last moment of silence to the dead, and then turned back to go home. It was still only mid-afternoon as we trotted back home in silence. Mother and Lyric were busy with housework, so Mother had asked me to go into town and do some shopping. I threw on my saddlebags and got the list of what to buy from her. She kissed me on the horn and thanked me for running the errand. I said it was my pleasure, and smiled slightly at her. Work had finished early, and there was little else to do, so I was glad for the distraction. I left our house and began trotting towards the town center. The sun was beginning to go down, but I still had plenty of light left to get the shopping done. I could even dawdle a little, and I could still make it before dark. Nothing on the list was needed right away, anyhow, so speed was not a necessity. As I walked towards the center of town, I noticed how very empty the streets were. I was only a few blocks from the town square, and I still hadn't encountered any pony. Even months ago, the streets were busy and filled with ponies going about their business. But now the streets were lined with boarded up houses, whole families having died out due to the plague. The whole town was becoming a place of ruin. Empty and abandoned houses littered it, and no new ponies moved in to fill the gaps. The houses began to become dilapidated and hazardous. It was sad to see the town in which I grew up in such a state. It made me remember how horrible the times we now live in are. As I neared the town center, the last bastion of liveliness in our town, I caught a glimpse of a white-coated mare with a pink mane. Her name was Candy, and she was the daughter of the town's sweetmaker. She was a beautiful mare, and she was always cheerful, despite the gloominess of the town around us. And she herself was learning to make sweets from her father. Her sweets were delicious, and had a unique decoration which represented her personality. They were one of the few things in this world left that were able to spread happiness, and she handed them out freely to those who cannot pay. She is truly a beacon of hope in this darkness. I had fancied her for a while, and luckily, none in her family had been stricken with the plague. I never made my feelings known to her, however. Being surrounded by death in a rapidly dying town kind of ruins the romantic mood. If the plague should ever be cured, if this terror ends, if we both survive it, I want to tell her that I love her. But the way things are going, my hope of doing that is draining. I'm getting distracted. I shouldn't dwell on such depressing things at the moment. Today was a good day. Perhaps the plague is dying out. I can at least try and hope to have hope, I suppose. I turned to my task and purchased what Mother had asked me to. With the state of our town, prices changed all the time. Some things have run out, and other things were running low. It strains our budget, but some things are simply necessary. With the supply gathered, I returned home for the night. For weeks, things continued in a similar fashion. The sun would rise each day, and the mourner would give their speech. The dead would be brought out and taken to our clinic. My father and I would inspect the bodies, slice them open, sew them up, and then dispose of them properly, and the sun would set. However, my hope that the plague was dying out was quickly dashed. The bodies started coming in mass. A day didn't go by when there wasn't over 100 dead. One day peaked at 197 deaths. Our town's remaining population of 5,261 rapidly declined to 2,116 remaining ponies. A week into this large number of deaths, the stallion who pulled the corpse wagon died himself. And so, my father took over for him, and the wagon became ours. He would wake up hours earlier than usual, so he could start collecting the bodies. It took its toll on him. He became exhausted, running some days on only a few hours of sleep. His usual chipper and carefree attitude changed into a gloomy daze, and he rarely talked. I didn't realize until just then how much my father meant to me. I always loved him, yes, but now, seeing how this sudden change completely altered his personality, it was hard to see. Instead of greeting me in the mornings with a happy joke, he just gave me a defeated nod. The monotony of this was ended one night, when a Pegasus buck fell from the sky. The fall had broken his neck, and his body was taken to our clinic. It was strange. I had never examined the body of a Pegasus before. Our town was mostly earth ponies and a few unicorns. No Pegasi. All Pegasi belonged to the Sky Flotilla, the kingdom of the Pegasi up in the clouds. Seeing one for myself was odd. For a group of ponies to think that they are all above each other, or above the others, they certainly seem as normal as us. Since he arrived in our clinic after our work for the day had completed, both my father and I had the chance to look him over. Rumors floated around that the Pegasi were immune to the plague, and thus only we beings confined to the ground were dying. I was curious to see if this was true or not. His body was bloody enough that it looked like he could have the plague. However, that could just as easily be contributed to the fall. So after a slight outer examination, we decided to cut him open. I did the honors in cutting him open and exposing his insides. Same procedures as the other. My father and I gazed at the insides of the Pegasus buck. Before our eyes, we saw that the rumor was just that, a rumor. His organs were blackened, ruptured, and bloody. Sure, the fall could have caused some internal damage, but nothing on the scale we were looking at. He had the plague. That much was certain. And with the Pegasi in the sky, safely above the diseased world below, could catch and die from the plague, the hope of survival took a downward plunge. We had seen enough, and quickly sewn him back up. It was late, so instead of burying his body today, we just put him in the storage room. We would burn his body tomorrow, with the others. After Father and I cleaned up the clinic, and ourselves, it was already time for us to sleep. It had been a long day, and the Pegasi buck had given us some short-lived excitement. I bid my father good night, and we went to our rooms and prayed to the stars that the number of dead would be low tomorrow. He shouldn't have gone to bed that night.